Welcome back. In this section, we're going to have an overview of skeletal muscle. And so let's start with some functions related just to skeletal muscle. First of all, without skeletal muscle, we wouldn't have support for the body. It helps us counteract the forces of gravity so that we can have an upright position. It also allows us to make our bones move because it's attached to our skeleton. It also allows other structures to move, such as your eyeball and some of your respiratory structures we'll learn about later on because they are attached to skeletal muscle. Third function is because when muscles contract, and that requires energy, it gives off heat. So that helps us maintain a constant body temperature, because otherwise we would be cold. And when we're cold, we will shiver and our individual muscles to all of our hairs will contract, which will generate heat. Our shivering generates heat, which will then help us maintain that constant body temperature. Continuing on, we have fluid in our veins as well as in lymphatic vessels that the walls don't have muscles in them, because the muscles they do have would be smooth muscle that cannot counteract the effects of gravity to move upward. So what happens is they are deep and surrounded by skeletal muscle. So when the skeletal muscle contracts, that helps push the fluid upward. So it's moving the fluids in those cardiovascular and lymphatic vessels back upwards towards the heart. Another function is in your abdominal area, as well as in your back. We have multiple layers of skeletal muscle there, which help protect our internal organs. And the last general function is that the tendons that indirectly attach our muscles to our bones, they cross the joints. And by doing so, they help stabilize those synovial joints, because otherwise those synovial joints with their cavities would be more prone to dislocations. So let's look at how skeletal muscles are named, because when you look at the names, it all seems like, oh, just a whole bunch of Latin names, which are very confusing. Well, the first thing is oftentimes there is a word that gives a clue as to the size. So when we talk about your glutes, for example, there are 3 different glute muscles, and they're like Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. The biggest would be the gluteus maximus, and then we would have the middle-sized gluteus medius and the smallest gluteus minimus. And so you can tell them by size, but if you take anatomy, you will learn to tell them by looking at the direction of the muscle fiber, because the muscle fiber direction will actually help you figure out what the action is. Second way muscles are named has to do with their shape. For instance, here on the left, you can see these 2 muscles that go between the scapula. Remember, the shoulder blade, or scapula is a name you do need to know, is attached to spinous processes of your vertebrae, your thoracic vertebrae here, by this muscle, which has the shape kind of like a parallelogram, which, if you remember from geometry, is an example of a rhomboid. So we have 2 rhomboid-shaped muscles here. The big one is called the rhomboid major, and the smaller one is called the rhomboid minor. Interestingly, in the cat, the rhomboid major is actually smaller than the rhomboid minor. But they're named not for in the cat, they're named for in the human. Another example is this muscle on the anterior part of your rib cage, and you can see how it goes zigzag back and forth. And so it is named for like this big, like what you would call a bread knife or a serrated knife. And so it's called the serratus anterior because it's on the anterior part of your rib cage. A third example for skeletal muscle names would be location. So here on your temple, you all know that word, the muscle that is right there for when you have like a tension headache is called the temporalis muscle. A fourth example for naming muscle names has to do with the direction of the fiber. So in your abdomen, we actually have 3 different layers of muscle. One of the layers, the muscle fibers go in this horizontal or transverse direction, and so they are called the transverse abdominis muscles. The other 2 layers, the muscles go in an oblique direction, so we have an internal oblique layer, and then deep to it, we have an external oblique layer on the outside, and deep to it, we're gonna have an internal oblique layer. Another example for naming has to do with the attachment. So this bone you should know as the tibia. You can recognize it. It's T-shaped at the top. It's flat. And then it articulates with your thigh bone up above. And so this muscle sits right in front of the tibia. So it's called the tibialis anterior, the word anterior meaning towards the front of the body. Another example has to do with the number of attachments. So you know the biceps and the triceps in your arm. However, we actually have 2 biceps. In other words, we have 2 muscles that have 2 attachments. The one up here in your arm is called the biceps brachii, because brachium is the Latin word for arm. So we have a biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. And then in your thigh, we have the biceps femoris because it attaches to that bone you need to know, the femur. And the last example for naming skeletal muscles would have to do with the action. So this one you can see is attaching to the cervical spine, to the skull up there, and then it attaches to your shoulder blade once again, or your scapula. And so this one, I just say, somehow the E got lost from the word elevator. And so this one elevates the scapula. In other words, it raises the scapula upright. And so that's its action. So those are examples of why muscles were named what they were naming. It wasn't to confuse you, but it was to give you information about that muscle. So there was less to actually memorize about that muscle. When we look at the basic structure of a muscle, what we can see is the muscle itself doesn't attach directly to the bone. There's going to be a tendon that attaches it indirectly. And then when we look at the muscle, we can see the muscle is divided into sections. And in between sections, we're going to have little arteries and veins, and we're going to have little nerves in there. And then inside the sections, we have these little things. And what these little individual things are myocytes or muscle fibers or muscle cells. So all of those are synonyms for each other's. Okay, so I'll probably be using myocytes and muscle fibers when I'm talking about a muscle cell. We just don't use the term muscle cell very often. And so this myocyte is the same thing that you have been looking at previously with the nuclei pushed off to the cell over there, the striated muscle fiber. As I said previously, it attaches indirectly into a tendon. And as you can see, it basically changes from muscle tissue to a dense, regular connective tissue. And then this tendon, which is dense, regular connective tissue, is going to continue with the dense, irregular connective tissue of the periosteum. So let's take a closer look at the tendons for the muscles, because this is how the muscles attach to your skeleton. And what you'll realize is that each muscle has 2 attachments. Okay, so this is not your biceps brachii. This is a muscle that's deep to your biceps. And I know your whole life you have thought your biceps is the muscle that actually flexes your elbows, the prime mover for flexing your elbow. And you've given it a lot of credit. It is a helper, but it is not the #1 muscle that does the action. This muscle right here, which is called the brachialis, is the muscle that does that movement. but that's okay. I just want to show the brachialis because you can see its attachments easier. Okay. And so when we are flexing this muscle, what we know is we are moving the forearm closer to the arm. So this muscle is attached to the humerus and it's attached to the ulna. So we're going to move the ulna closer to the humerus. And so whereas this muscle is going to be attached to the scapula, it's going to be attached to the humerus. So when we look at muscles, we have to look at where are they attached? And of the two attachments, which place can move more? So between your torso and your extremity is going to move more. Your torso is going to move less. Between your arm and your forearm, or if this was your thigh and your leg, your arm or your thigh would move less than your forearm or your leg. And so that attachment would be called the origin. The origin is the more fixed attachment, whereas the other attachment would be the insertion, the more mobile attachment. And what you have to realize is that the insertion will be on the other side of a joint that's being moved. So in this muscle crossing the elbow, the insertion is close to the elbow. On this other muscle, you can see that the origin's actually closer to the shoulder and the insertion is further away, but you can see that the origin and the insertion are on opposite sides of the shoulder. And so that means that the shoulder is the joint being moved for this muscle. And then for this muscle, that means the elbow is the joint being moved. Now, I don't want you to think that it's always what is downstream that is going to be the more mobile attachment. For instance, if we look between your chest and your head, we have muscles that go here from your sternum and your clavicle to your head. And you can move your head a lot more than you can move your sternum and your clavicle. So the origin is here and the insertion is on your head. Okay. So when muscles contract, that contracting muscle is going to pull on the tendon at the insertion, which is going to move that bone closer to the origin of the muscle. And so that is what is happening with a muscle contraction. So if that muscle or its tendon crosses the joint, it must move that joint. Now notice, this muscle that I showed you here is not crossing the wrist, so it can't move the wrist. It's not crossing the shoulder. It can't move the shoulder. It's not crossing my neck. It can't move my neck. The only thing that this muscle that it's showing right here, this brachialis muscle is crossing is the elbow. So the only joint it can be moving is the elbow. And so the joint it has to move when it contracts is the elbow. And I want to make sure you really understand when a muscle contracts, it is pulling. There is no pushing. So if you're saying, Dr. Powell, I can push a cart. Well, you're not going to push a cart by contracting and flexing your elbow. You're going to push a cart by extending your elbow, by contracting your triceps brachii and extending your elbow. It's a different muscle that is contracting. So that brings up the fact that muscles usually work together, at least in pairs. And so the muscle that's doing the work, the synergist. So at flexing, that's what we were showing here. When I talked about extending, the synergist would be the triceps brachii. So the synergist is the muscle contracting to do the work. The one that does the opposite would be the antagonist. The antagonist has to relax because its actions oppose the synergist. So, for example, if the biceps brachii up here is contracting with elbow flexion, that means the triceps, the antagonist, has to relax. But if I want to push the car, I want to extend my elbow. That is making the triceps brachii the synergist. It's contracting to do the work. That means the bicep has become the antagonist. It has to relax. Okay. You know it's relaxed because if it was contracted, it would flex. So it has to relax to extend. No, it's usually not just one muscle and one muscle. It's oftentimes groups of muscles working together. So let me give you an example that you already know about, and that is your quadriceps, which is not one muscle, but a group of 4 muscles, and your hamstrings, which is a group of 3 muscles. So in your anterior thigh, we have your quadriceps muscles. And when they contract, they extend your knee. So in this picture, your quadriceps are all working together as synergists. Your hamstrings in your posterior thigh, when they contract, they flex your knee. So in this picture, they are antagonists. They are relaxing because the knee is extended. Their action, knee flexion, opposes the synergist, the quadriceps, whose action is knee extension. Okay. Hope those 2 examples help you understand this concept. We've got another concept to talk about, but to do that, I need to refresh your memory about the neuron and the parts of the neuron. So you remember that the dendrites were incoming messages that the cell body then interpreted. We had 100 messages that said it was hot, 80 messages that said it was cold. So it interpreted, oh, it's hot. Then it sent an outgoing message down the axon saying it's hot. At the end of the axon, we had an axon terminal where that axon branched into up to 100 little branches. And this was the end, the terminal, the end point of the axon. But it's not just a flat end, it actually branches down there. Okay. So for skeletal muscle to move, we need what's called a motor neuron. Motor is movement. Okay. So we need a neuron coming from the central nervous system, from the brain or the spinal cord, going to skeletal muscle, telling it it needs to move. Okay. So that message will come down the axon to the axon terminal, come down one of the axon terminals all the way to a myocyte, because these skeletal muscle cells would be excited by motor neurons, and we will find out how in later videos. Okay, so here's that axon coming down to axon terminals. As you can see, this one is showing branching in 3 different places, and this one's showing all the 3 places going to the same myocyte. Now, that's not true in real life, but it's fine for this picture. What I need you to realize is the axon of one neuron can only stimulate cells of one muscle. So one neuron can only go to one muscle, but it can go to multiple different cells in that one muscle. And I'll be showing pictures of that. Okay. But one neuron cannot go to multiple different muscles. You saw how the muscles were in group. The entire muscle itself is surrounded by connective tissue, and each muscle has its own nerve. okay? And in that nerve, we're gonna have distinct neurons, okay? And so that neuron is part of the nerve going to that muscle. Okay. So here's the nerve going to a muscle, and here's an example of a neuron, one little neuron from that muscle going, and it's showing 4 different muscle fibers or 4 different myocytes. And so it's showing that it's branching, this one branching into 4 different ones, so it's stimulating 4 different cells, okay? This one is showing 2 different neurons, a red one that branches into 4, showing it's stimulating 4 different myocytes. And then here there is a green neuron that branches into 2 and is stimulating 2 different myocytes. And what you can see is that one of the myocytes it's stimulating was not stimulated by a red neuron, but one of the cells was also stimulated by the red neuron. So that shows that a myocyte can be stimulated by more than one neuron, not by more than one nerve, but by more than one neuron of that nerve. Okay, so it's still just one nerve, but it can be more than one neuron of that nerve. Okay, because remember, a nerve is a bunch of axons traveling together, thousands of them traveling together. Okay, so that brings us to this concept I was trying to get to, and that is a motor unit. So this definition is one you need to understand, and there's 2 parts to a motor unit. A motor neuron. Okay, so a motor unit is not just a motor neuron. A motor neuron is a motor neuron. But a motor unit is the motor neuron plus all the muscle fibers. So in other words, a motor neuron plus all the individual muscle cells that motor neuron is innervating. So in this picture in the bottom right, the photomicrograph, you can see this motor neuron coming down, and it has 3 branches. So it's doing this cell, and then it's going off to another cell there. In the cartoon drawing, you see this motor neuron having 4 branches. This one's doing this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and there. And so it's going to a lot of different muscle fibers. So each one of these things, these round things, is an individual muscle fiber or muscle cell. Okay. And that can give us something known as an axon to muscle fiber ratio. In other words, how many muscle fibers does one axon from one neuron innervate? So it's going to be 1 to something. Okay. How many muscle cells is this one neuron innervating? And the average is 1 axon, so 1 motor neuron, on average innervates 150 different cells. So if we have a nerve impulse going down 1 axon, typically 150 different cells can contract. Okay, 150 cells, great. But in the eyeball, where we have skeletal muscles moving your eyeball, when 1 motor neuron only innervates 23 cells, which means we can do very tiny movements. In contrast, your gastrocnemius muscle in the back of your calf, 1 motor neuron innervates over 1,000 cells. So when that nerve impulse comes down, over 1,000 cells are going to contract, which gives you a lot of force and strength if you want to stand up on tippy toe. Okay? So do you see why we don't want 150 everywhere? We want motor units of different sizes, depending if we want fine motor control or for movement, or if we want strength. Okay. And this brings us to the last concept, which is the all or none principle. When a nerve impulse travels down that axon, all the muscle fibers, all of these innervated by that axon are stimulated at the same time. And so all of them are going to contract or none of them are going to contract. Okay. In other words, you can't be like, oh, it's kind of weak. It's not quite strong enough. So let's just have half of them contract. Like if you're at the fair and you're hitting and you have to get it all the way to hit the bell to wing the big stuffed teddy bear and you only get it halfway, they're not going to give you a smaller teddy bear, or they're not just going to give you the head of the teddy bear. It's the same thing here. Either all it's going to be strong enough that all of them are going to contract, or we're not going to have an impulse and none of them are going to contract. This is not the same thing as the entire muscle is contracting. It has to do with the motor unit. Okay. So if the impulse is coming down the red, all of these red ones are going to contract. The purple's not contracting because this muscle, even this part of this muscle, is showing that it has two motor units, has a red and a purple. If the impulse is only coming down the purple, then only these two cells are contracting and these other three cells are not contracting. And then none of these other cells are contracting. Each muscle contains many motor units. Okay. And depending how many are getting an impulse at one time will show you how strong, will result in how strong that muscle contraction is. All right. So I just put this here just because every now and then we just need a cute picture. And so these are all just baby vertebrates, just to show you all of these animals have skeletal muscles attached to their skeleton, which helps them move. So I'll see you soon when we come back and we look at the microanatomy of the structural and functional unit for all skeletal muscle for all of these animals, including humans. I'll see you soon, and thank you for all your work.